Welcome to the test server. Today I want to show you a new weapon called Bouncecritter. The name is pretty literal because the entire weapon is built around two things: bounces and critical hits. When Bouncecritter lands a critical hit, that shot does not just deal double damage. The round also returns to the magazine, and the projectile can rebound to another enemy inside its rebound radius. But the rebound is not simply a copy of the first hit. The first critical hit only triggers the bounce. Once it reaches the second target, that damage gets a separate chance to become a critical hit of its own. By default, the rebound radius is 20 meters, and a legendary implant takes it to 26. There is one important restriction: the targets need direct line of sight to each other. An enemy can be within 26 meters of the mech you are shooting, but if it is tucked behind a corner, the bounce will not reach it. Crit chance increases with the weapon's rank. At its 5-star legendary starting point, it is 30%. At max rank, it reaches 40%, and the dedicated implant adds another 30 percentage points. That gives us 70% crit chance in a maxed build. And this is actually the first weapon with its own crit chance implant. For Bouncecritter, that implant is almost mandatory. It increases the damage, extends the effective magazine, and triggers the weapon's main mechanic, the rebound, much more often. On the stat card, the magazine looks tiny. It only holds 8 rounds. But because critical hits return ammunition, the actual firing sequence can last much longer. A stock 5-star version with no implants, assuming you do not miss, fires for about 13 seconds on average. A maxed version with 70% crit chance runs for roughly 31 seconds. That is more than twice as long, and in a real match, it can genuinely feel like an endless magazine. That is why the crit chance implant does much more than the plus 30% label suggests. At max rank, moving from 40% to 70% crit chance takes the expected number of shots from the same 8-round magazine from roughly 13 to almost 27. In other words, the effective magazine doubles. Of course, that is an average, not a guarantee. There is still RNG here. Sometimes the magazine ends much sooner, and sometimes a long chain of critical hits keeps it going. That is also why accuracy matters so much with Bouncecritter. A miss is not just lost damage, it is also a lost chance to refund a round and trigger a rebound. But do not confuse a long magazine with high DPS. At 5 stars, Bouncecritter deals roughly 58% of the DPS of a 5-star minigun. In a maxed build with the crit chance implant, that rises to about 76% of the DPS of a maxed minigun. That comparison only counts damage to the primary target while the weapons are firing. It does not include rebound damage. So in a straight one-on-one fight, Bouncecritter is clearly weaker than Minigun. But if there is a second target nearby, and the weapon keeps finding rebounds, its total damage across the enemy team becomes much more interesting. When we include the rebound's full base damage and its separate crit roll, a maxed Bouncecritter with the crit chance implant can reach roughly 130% of Minigun's total DPS across 2 targets. That is raw damage before Galvanic and other modules, and it is split between 2 mechs, so this does not mean Bouncecritter suddenly kills one target faster. But it does show the weapon's real role: low single target DPS, with potentially strong team damage when the enemies are positioned correctly. Another strange thing about Bouncecritter is that it is officially classified as a barrage weapon, but it fires straight-line projectiles that behave more like rockets. Its optimal range is 60 meters, its maximum range is 80, and there is no implant that can extend it. That makes it best suited to mechs that can control the distance themselves. They need to get inside 60 meters, avoid getting stuck in front of the enemy, and then reposition quickly when the fight moves. Projectile speed is 200. That is not slow, but it is not fast enough to make every shot against a moving target at 60 or 80 meters a guaranteed hit. Bouncecritter has 4 weapon implants: damage, crit chance, reload, and rebound radius. Damage and crit chance are the core of the build for me. The reload implant cuts the reload by 30%, from 7 seconds to 4.9. Rebound radius increases the bounce distance from 20 meters to 26. So if one slot has to go to an ability implant and the choice comes down to reload or radius, the answer is pretty obvious to me. 2 seconds off the reload is nice, but 6 extra meters for the weapon's main mechanic can decide whether the rebound happens at all. And this is a radius, not just 6 extra meters in one direction. If we compare a 20-meter circle with a 26-meter circle, the potential search area for the second target grows by roughly 69%. Walls and the actual map geometry will remove part of that space, but the implant still gives you much more than the phrase "just 6 meters" suggests. And if the enemies on a particular map are almost never within those 26 meters, the implant is not the problem. It is probably just not a good Bouncecritter map. That brings us to the main downside. The stock weapon does not only have lower DPS, it also punishes missed shots much more heavily. And closer to the endgame, it runs into another problem: Galvanic Hull. A critical hit is made up of the base damage and an additional bonus portion. Galvanic does not erase the entire shot, but it absorbs the critical bonus. So against a very common endgame defense, Bouncecritter loses part of its damage even though the ammo refund and rebound still work. That makes the weapon a little contradictory. It gets the most from heavy investment, max rank, a leveled crit chance implant, and preferably Rebound Radius. But that is also where Galvanic Hull becomes more common and removes part of the value from those critical hits. There is one more very interesting detail about Rebound that changes your target priority. The damage direction for the Rebound is not based on where the projectile physically hits the second mech. The game uses the angle of your first shot. So if you hit the first target in the back, the Rebound also gets the rear damage multiplier against the second enemy, even if it visually strikes that mech from the front. And the reverse is also true. If you shoot the first target from the front, the Rebound does not become back damage just because it lands in the back of the second mech. That means the best target in a group is not always the mech with the lowest HP. Sometimes it is better to shoot the enemy whose back you can reach, especially if another target is standing nearby. The first mech then becomes a launch point for a stronger rebound. If we are talking about maximum firepower with 2 Bouncecritter 16s, the main requirements are obvious: 32 energy, enough mobility, and no heavy dependence on ability implants. Mimica is the ideal candidate for me. It is fast, it has enough energy for 2 Bouncecritter 16s, and it can hold the correct distance better than most mechs. Panther, Solis, and Redox also look good. Panther can create a safe firing window behind its barrier. Solis and Redox can control the target, which is very useful for a weapon with direct projectiles. It is simply easier to avoid misses against a blinded or slowed enemy. Blockhorn can work as well thanks to its 32 energy, protection, and amp zone. But it is slower, so balancing around that 60-meter range becomes more difficult. I would not limit Bouncecritter to heavy mechs, though. 2 non-heavy options also surprised me during testing. The first is Tailsting. With 24 energy, it cannot match the raw firepower of a heavy mech carrying 2 Bouncecritter 16s, but Signal Jammer partly compensates for that weakness. An affected enemy takes 30% more damage and, more importantly, cannot fire back or use its ability for several seconds. That is a very comfortable combination for Bouncecritter. It helps compensate for the relatively low DPS, while creating a safe window for a long and accurate firing sequence. The enemy cannot return fire or turn to track you, so it becomes much easier to land shots, refund ammunition, and trigger rebounds. The second and much less obvious option is Zephyr. I tested it with a very aggressive implant setup. 3 weapon implants, with Shock Pulse Radius as the only ability implant. No cooldown and no duration. I am not saying this is an ideal build, or that Zephyr is suddenly back in the meta, but in practice, it feels surprisingly decent to get 3 full seconds of firing into a locked down enemy that cannot shoot back while rebounds spread from that target to nearby mechs. Shock Pulse does not increase the damage itself, it simply guarantees a short but very clean window to use the weapon. So I would divide the mech choices into 2 groups. Heavy mechs give Bouncecritter maximum weapon energy and compensate for its low DPS with more raw firepower. Tailsting and Zephyr give up some of that firepower, but their abilities create a moment where the direct projectiles are easier to land without taking return fire. And it is important not to confuse 2 different things here. The best mechs for Bouncecritter are not necessarily using the best weapon available to them. The best scenario for this weapon is a small, tight map where enemies naturally stay close together. Compact 3-beacon CPC maps are the obvious example because fights keep forming around the same narrow routes. Rebound Radius can consistently matter there, and the 80-meter maximum range is much less restrictive. That also gives us some very simple counterplay. Do not stand within 26 meters of a teammate with a clear line between you. Even a slight angle, a wall, or different elevations can remove Bouncecritter's main advantage. This weapon does not just punish one mech, it punishes bad spacing between two players. So my verdict is this: Bouncecritter is not a universal meta weapon, and it is definitely not a simple purchase that will perform equally well the moment you unlock it. It is a specialized weapon with relatively low single target DPS, a heavy dependence on accuracy, rank, and implants, and a clear weakness against Galvanic Hull. But with the right maxed build on a 32 energy mech or a mech whose ability compensates for the weapon's weaknesses, and on a compact map where the rebound regularly finds a second target, it can be very interesting, especially when 8 rounds suddenly turn into half a minute of continuous fire. And that is exactly why judging Bouncecritter only by its 8-round magazine or only by its DPS would be a mistake. The weapon's real value comes from how often you can turn a critical hit into another round and a real rebound against a second target.